From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Georgette Dorn. I'm the chief of the Hispanic Division of the Library of Congress, and I'm so pleased to see so many people here on such a terrible, rainy, and dark day. So welcome, welcome to the Hispanic Division. I also wanted to tell you how pleased I am to be talking to people who have never been here before, because I don't know your faces. So you must be from Georgetown University, I assume? No? Well, it's great to have you. We do have the most wonderful Hispanic collection anywhere in the world. Because we have books not only published in Latin America, but also books about Latin America published in China, Japan, Germany, all over the world. So for that reason, our secondary book collection and newspaper collection there's no rival in the world. In addition, we have lots of microfilms, newspapers, manuscripts, prints and photographs, and we have about 8 million maps and atlases. So if you can find time, please use our collection. It's a great pleasure now to introduce Christie Arce, who is one of our users of our collections. She's a professor of Spanish and Latin American literature, 18th and 19th century, at the University of Miami in Coral Gables. She's a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, PhD, and a master's from Middlebury College, and an undergraduate degree from Santa Barbara, California. And she's the author of this wonderful book, Mexico Nobodies, which is going to be on sale outside. So with us, Christie Arce.
Wow. I guess I'd like to know where everyone is from, because if Georgette, Miss Dorn doesn't know you, I'd like to know where you hailed from on a rainy, miserable day, such as today. The universities? I feel like maybe there's a class here. No. Really? Just interest? Wow. Well, this is fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming today. This is such a pleasure. And in particular, Dr. Anna Dini and Catalina Gomez for their initiative in organizing today's event, and especially to Georgette Dorn, the chief of the Hispanic Division, for graciously supporting this event as part of Hispanic Heritage Month at the Library of Congress. It's an honor for me to present this book in this prestigious place of learning that's dedicated to the preservation of knowledge. 8 million maps. That's incredible. I'm beholden to my colleagues for engaging with my work. Please have a seat. Have a seat. There's seats. And I think it's especially apropos given that my book grapples with the invisibilized histories of women in Mexico. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about how I began this project many, many years ago. I was a first year's master's student in political science, and I took a course on Mexican history just for fun. As a Mexican American, I wanted to know a little bit more about Mexican history. And in the textbook that was assigned to us, there was 3/4 of a page dedicated to the soldadera, the female camp followers of the Mexican Revolution. Intrigued, I searched for more information, and when I asked my father who they were, he responded that they were the wives of the soldiers. And soon I realized that this was a euphemistic way to refer to the women who appeared in all the films I had watched with my family on Sunday afternoons on one of the few Spanish channels in Los Angeles at the time. This led me to consider who were these women, these wives. Can you hear me? Okay. And why were they in all the photographs and films of the Mexican Revolution when not even a page on them was included in a primer, an historical primer of over 500 pages? So in the course of this informal research on these women warriors, I happened upon the only novel dedicated entirely to a female camp follower turned colonel, La Negra Angustias. And like most Mexicans at the time, I too was unfamiliar with the importance of Afro-descendants to Mexican culture. And I found it striking that an award-winning novel could be written about a black female coronela when Afro-Mexicans are not considered a relevant part of Mexican culture, if at all. These paradoxes whereby the cultural imaginary is saturated with images of anonymous camp followers in everything from photography, film, art, and popular balladry, including songs as popular as, you perhaps know them, the Cucaracha and the Adelita, yet the real women in official history are unknown, is what inspired this book. Thus, I explore how individual people come to embody larger conceptual metaphors in Mexican history, such as how, for example, the soldadera as an occupation came to represent the overwhelming cultural panic provoked by women bursting out of the home and into the public sphere, and considered the role that the arts played in understanding these people and their contributions to Mexican culture and history. So I'm going to start by reflecting on the cover of the book. This photograph is an Afro-Mexican coronela, originally thought to be a soldadera from Michoacan. And it's one of the many portraits attributed to the famous Mexican photographer Agustín Casasola throughout the maelstrom of the revolution. Not surprisingly, this portrait was showcased on the flyers for an exhibit titled The African Presence in Mexico, From Yanga to the Present, which opened at the Mexican Fine Arts Museum in Chicago and traveled to San Antonio, Los Angeles, Oakland, Washington, D.C., among other places between 2006 and 2011. Taken against an improvised rustic white background, the first thing that arrests the viewer's eye, as with many portraits, is the subject's gaze. This sitter is strong and self-conscious. You'll notice her chin is lifted with her head pointing slightly to the left, yet her gaze looks straight forward, piercing the congealing materiality of the photograph, perhaps looking towards where the photographer, supposedly Casasola, may have been standing. Her gaze is imposing, and yet the language of her body is as impressive as her gaze. Nonetheless, the comfortable positioning of her body contradicts the threat hinted at by the lowered hand's proximity to the gun that's holstered in her pant pocket. Revealing the multiple codes signified by the term soldadera, which in traditional parlance precludes military agency, but often led directly to it, to call her a soldadera and not a soldier, a soldada, deflects the military nature of her position, and thus she's technically demoted. So often in the work studied in this book, soldadera as a word choice, which comes from the word soldada, which actually means soldier's pay, not female soldiers' pay, what they're paid with, is exchanged for another more dignified one, or in contrast, soldadera is often used as an insult. This portrait is staged, but does not follow the tradition typical of military heraldry, such as the contraposta, the three-quarter positioning of the head. But the medals displayed on her chest and the strategic position of the gun indicate that she was a recognized military officer within the Revolutionary Army, and not simply a wife, laundress, cook, or prostitute. Certainly what's intriguing about this portrait for the spectator is the fact that she is both a soldadera and a soldier, male and female, decorative but practical, and as a mulata, black and white. And yet, when compared to the gallery of photographic images that have been showcased of male soldiers during the Revolution, thoroughly Mexican. She is quite comfortable in the traditional male realm of war, yet is not quite ready to give up the accoutrements of a feminine aesthetic. The ribbon adorning her peasant's zapatista hat and her earrings that are long and dangling create a striking counterpoint to the gun she has not removed from her pant pocket. Or maybe that is the point. Perhaps the viewer is being instructed not to conflate the vestiges of female attire with weakness. This woman seems to embody the contradictions of the war of the war and the term soldadera, in addition to the post-revolutionary ideal of mestizaje. Considering how Mexican blackness is figured into the marginalized experience of the soldadera adds one more layer to the soldadera's already overblown and yet simplified legacy. The portrait of this real woman, now tenuously identified as Coronela Carmen Robles from Guerrero, not Michoacan, in 1914, has traveled the visual imagery of Afro-Mexican scholars, but has only recently, and I mean recently, recuperated a proper name. Alongside this excavated new identity are only brief lines, fragmentary and conclusive and sometimes contradictory. Just last week I had an anthropologist who saw the cover of my book say, "Do you know for sure that that's who that is?" And I said, "No, but that's who they think she is." Inconclusive and contradictory to fill in the gaps of her story. This portrait defies a static iconicity that congeals and decontextualizes, and instead points to another more powerful knowledge, saber, that has led to multiple identifications and a concomitant slippery truth. Women were in the background, but also took fierce and strategic military roles. This image is testament to this woman's misunderstood history, multiple names, and elided blackness, and the fraught nature of Mexican womanhood in general. This nobody, like all the other nobodies I discuss in my book, is still looking at us and is still claiming her place in the making of one of the most important social revolutions of the 20th century. So the first part of the book, Entre Adelitas y Cucarachas, the soldaderas trope in the Mexican Revolution, explores the movement of the soldaderas and their peripatetic migrations outside of the domestic domain and into the public sphere, creating what I call a mobile habitus, or as James Clifford has theorized, a dwelling in travel. Soldaderas were crucial to military success in Mexico, and regardless of whose side they were on or what role they adopted. I contend that the term soldadera, etymologically ambiguous, becomes a word to describe what was socially unacceptable. It's a way to debase the real worth of a militarily active female participant of war, and a way to describe women living outside of the confines of traditional home. As soldaderas, they cannot expect any remuneration or even recognition. By breaking from what Diana Taylor calls from traditional notions of female behavior, they created what Diana Taylor calls a performative scenario on top of the train, around the campfire, straggling behind the men. This scenario, which is repeatable, prosaic, yet multivalent, would brand their place in the imaginary of Mexicans for generations to come through revolutionary practices and tactics and divergent occupations of place and space. So the second chapter explores the representation of these women in literary, visual, and oral cultural production by unpacking the prevailing tropes that originate in the corridos, the popular ballads called La Lolita and La Cucaracha. And I'm just curious if you guys have heard, we've all heard La Cucaracha, sure? No? Adelita's similar, no? There have been even samba, rockabilly renditions of Adelita. So it's a very important rhythm that's operates in international circuits of music. So this chapter considers how the overwhelming visibility and shocking presence of the soldadera forced popular balladeers to change the conventions naturalized by narrative balladry. So these corridos are not only recognized nationally, but are internationally emblems of Mexican folk music, and they operate as unofficial anthems of the revolution and come to represent the whole of female participation in the revolution. But what's ironic, of course, is that as ballads, as popular ballads by folklorists, they were not considered real examples of corridos, in part because of their of the rhythm and the lack of a narrative story. That there were never real stories told about female soldiers, just sort of abstracted ideals of womanhood. So in chapter 3 of the first half of the book, I discuss more ambivalent, even subversive soldadera figures that twist the rigidity of the cucaracha, who's the whore, and the Adelita, sort of the Barbie, the model, the sweetheart, that twist those stereotypes into unheard of forms that will constitute new, albeit ephemeral, practices of Mexican womanhood. In the second part of the book, so here we have examples of La Adelita and La Cucaracha. So there's 3 popular ballads there, excuse me. So the second part of the book, The Blacks in the Closet, unearths the legacy of the African presence in the Mexican cultural imaginary by focusing on the figure of the mulata and Mexican music in the form of son jarocho and the prevalence of música tropical. The mulata, like the soldadera, lacks a proper name and a place in society, identified only through the sexual congress of an anonymous black slave woman and usually a Spanish father. But unlike the muddled masses that define the image of the soldadera, mulatas mark their presence through their emergence of singular, exceptional figures that are easily brushed aside by the populace as curious anomalies. So the fourth chapter critically compares the coastal legend of the mulata de Córdoba, the mulata from Córdoba, with a real Inquisition case that's housed in the National Archives in Mexico City of a runaway slave named Antonia de Soto from northern Mexico. And I observe how this colonial legend of the Mulata de Córdoba, which was eventually turned into a one-act opera, reflects a whole mythology regarding black women in Mexico. They are associated with witchcraft, magic, unknown origins, or as a tropicalized elsewhere that infected the local populace with its hypersexualized presence, and then disappeared. So these disappearing acts will mark the legacy of all blacks in Mexico. There are glimmers, hints, traces, and insinuations, but never claims about their contributions to Mexican history and culture. So this chapter, in short, examines how blacks were part and parcel of the nascent colonial regime and culture, but were overrepresented in the Inquisition archives and in the juridical language of heresy, witchcraft, and sexual dereliction. So I follow up my study of the colonial period by examining the figure of the mulata in Mexican films produced at the height of the Mexican Golden Era of cinema, and how they make an incipient attempt to contend with the problem of racism against blacks in Mexico through the tropes of mammies, tragic mulatas imported from the U.S. By representing blackness as exceptional or displacing it onto the Caribbean or abstracting the position of blacks in Mexico into a universal dilemma of racism as a part of the legacy of slavery, these films reproduce, I argue, the very racism that they attempt to rectify. The second part of the book concludes by discussing the audiotropic and sonic landscape of Mexico that is a product of the Afro-Mestizo culture of the Gulf Coast. I contend that blackness inserts itself into the fabric of the national narrative through its most popular songs, El Chuchumbe and La Bamba. We've all heard La Bamba, no? So such songs, and in particular La Bamba, are startling examples of how Mexico's nobodies are the subjects and originators of a musical tradition that would come to constitute the culture of a globalized Mexicanness. This chapter further discusses the impact of Cuban music on Mexican cultural production and identity by focusing on the exceptional figure of Toña la Negra, who is the matriarchal mulata, who is a national icon and performer of boleros, the favored music of the dance halls and brothels, and the Cuban son from the Gulf Coast of Mexico, Veracruz in particular. And it discusses how she paradoxically constitutes the quintessence of Mexicanness through her status as the model jarocha, despite her claim to blackness. So she's as Mexican as they come despite being black. So what do I mean by nobodies? What does it allow me to do? And I just wanted to notice that in the image there, that's Celia Cruz. And so there was a lot of interaction between Caribbean and Cuba in particular in Veracruz. And so there's this way in which blackness is displaced onto Caribbeanness, but in particular Cubanness. So what do I mean by nobodies, and what does it allow me to do? So what this book seeks to discover then is the way this gendered and racialized construct is belied, undone through the very art forms that perform this gendering and racializing, and how these pre-existing tropes are intertwined, reproduced, and yet contain gaping fault lines. While womanhood and race are invariably defined in concrete terms, the tremors that unsettle these constructs are manifested by the fascination with which both elites and peasants beheld and represented these extraordinary people, black, mulata, white, mestizo, and indigenous women. The cultural texts examined in this book, ranging from, as I mentioned, corridos, popular ballads, films, to opera, witness the complex ways in which traditional womanhood is defined by masculinist gestures and disrupted by racializing ones. Indeed, the anxieties regarding a hegemonic notion of race and gender are brought to task with the figure of the soldadera. Her simultaneous masculine and maternal heroism was an embarrassment to military officials, while the mulata triangulates native blackness with a foreign intrusion and exotic sexuality, providing a way to negotiate and explain unraveling sexual mores in the countryside and the corruption of white male desire. I argue that the figures who populate the literary, visual, and musical imaginary constitute much more than base entertainment for the masses or a curious motif in cultural production by patronizing elites. I argue that they reflect an almost latent communal will to narrate that which the official history often ignores. In the aesthetic, I claim, resides something more than artifice, possibility. So I propose Nobodies as an alternative to understanding this fundamental historical marginalization and its over-representation in the arts. As I've claimed, neither gender nor race as critical categories can be engaged independently. Mexican nationalist discourse and art grapple specifically with the tangled strands of both. In contrast to this nominal abstraction, the body in Nobody directly points to the very real and concrete place they have in the background, the spaces they occupy, the contributions they make, and the violence inflicted upon the flesh. Their nobodiness is clearly a product of their othering, but also the practical and strategic disappearing of them by Mexican national discourse through the denial of a proper name, Cucaracha Adelita, as well as the regulation of their bodies. This disappearing, however, happened in different ways. On the one hand, the over-representation of the soldadera in the crafting of a post-revolutionary identity blinds the spectator or reader through excess, while on the other, the absolute elision of blacks from the Mexican historical consciousness makes the striking figure of the mulata exotic and foreign. So the promulgation of a vacuous revolutionary rhetoric that serves only the authoritarian elites in the name of murdered peasant icons such as Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, is featured in this very famous image, Villa en la silla presidencial, Villa in the presidential seat, or local movements celebrated on the world stage that have not, in the case of Zapatismo, put La Ley Indígena, indigenous law, into place, nor in the case of Ayotzinapa today, brought justice to the families of the 43 disappeared students a few years ago, or even allowed Afro-Mexicans to be recognized as viable communities, is testament to the reality that Mexico is now more than ever an authoritarian state and that the road towards democracy is still long. However, as argued by Gareth Williams and myself, art registers the profound, necessary, and inevitable moments that allow us to think and be otherwise. The imagistic effect of this one portrait, the once nameless Afro-Mexican soldadera staring intently into the camera with her gun in her pocket, her military pins, her peasant Zapatista hat, and dangling earrings, defies the static post-revolutionary narrative of abnegated womanhood and melancholic mestizaje. This woman alone, through the multiple ambivalences communicated in the portrait and its contradictory captions, in all the versions that I read, there were probably at least 4 or 5 different captions of who this person was, speaks of all the different ways of being and becoming a post-revolutionary woman in Mexico. The corrido, the popular ballad, bears witness to this. Heralding war heroes and manly valor, it also did not ignore its women, if only to present them as cockroaches or Barbies, cucarachas and Adelitas. So this permits the disfiguring nature of cultural production to simultaneously reveal other possibilities beyond degenerate cucarachas or beguiling Adelitas, to imagine the real people who flitted in the background as playing an integral role in what is today Mexican culture, history, and politics. So before I conclude, I just wanted to mention that the image in the middle is, we've just recently discovered the same coronela that's been on the cover. It's on the cover of my book. It's not positively identified, but Mexican scholar John Mraz has been able to make a link between this image, who was also in the archive identified as a soldadera. It's clear she's not a soldadera, she's in the middle, right? But it was identified as soldadera. Now she's identified as Coronela Carmen Robles. As I was finishing the book, I still had to figure out. I went through all the different copies and I realized that this was the same person. So I'd like to conclude with a few words from my conclusion, To Be Otherwise. Okay. From May until August 2015, the Vincent Price Museum in East Los Angeles hosted a superb exhibition titled Soldadera by internationally renowned performance and video artist Nao Bustamante. The multimedia exhibition imagined, through what the Chicana artist calls a speculative reenactment, the soldadera's participation in the Mexican Revolution. Thoroughly mesmerizing, haunting, and dreamlike, at the same time it's tactile, concrete, and physical, the exhibition features several pieces that mix archival footage and photography, such as the images I just showed you, with Bustamante's revisionary imagistic work and material craft, blurring the boundaries between archive and invention, and rending at the same time, it weaves these women's stories tightly together through the symbol of a yellow, bullet-hugging Kevlar Edwardian dress that's featured in the middle of the image. Filling the exhibition hall, the cinematic installation was a 5-minute loop. You see that in the far left corner. It was a cinematic loop of a 5-minute loop of a mostly black and white film projected onto a 16:9 screen. The video transposed reenactments of soldaderas wearing Bustamante's yellow Kevlar dresses onto archival footage in order to create what Bustamante's rendition of the unfinished chapter dedicated to the soldadera from the film Que Viva Mexico by the Russian filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein. Unfortunately, he was unable to complete it because the project ran out of money and he was forced to leave Mexico before production on this segment could begin. So the soldadera's important role in the revolution was first visually imagined by an avant-garde Russian filmmaker, only to be completed 86 years later by a Chicana performance artist from the San Joaquin Valley, both outsiders. At the center of the room, in this exhibit, was a series of yellow dresses, bulky and prissy, thoroughly unfit for the battleground of war. The dresses, titled Tierra y Libertad Kevlar 2945, are crafted as bulletproof gowns that would withstand the piercing gunshots of the Winchester 30-30 rifle, the preferred weapon of the revolutionary insurgents. Kevlar, designed by a female chemist, is a synthetic material woven so tightly that it is 5 times stronger than steel. However, after a single penetration, it begins to unravel. Body armor the soldaderas never had, if only their real rebosos could have been lined with this stuff. It is a speculative tribute to the thousands of nameless, denigrated women who were killed on the battlefield, raped, or maimed, and left unrecognized. In the words of Hannah Manshell, and I quote, "Now Bustamante's Kevlar dresses are, in a way, garments protected by unraveling. The dresses perform a kind of vulnerability about thinness and thickness, a kind of vulnerability that cannot go to pieces. When hit by a bullet, or when cut by an artist's scissors, the fabric wears thin, unravels to protect the body inside," end of quote. The display includes several of the dresses, but only one lies in a glass box, the one we see here, a sleeping beauty, pierced with the slugs of an original Winchester 30-30. The remaining dresses will also eventually be fired on, and in this way, it is an ongoing performance that will continue to record and violate the imagined and invented bodies of these invisible women. Phantasmatic violence that continues to pierce, that withstands time and its punctuating deformations, ephemeral and yet ineluctably felt. Hidden at the back of the exhibition hall is an understated piece called the chacmul, perhaps the most complex component of the entire Soldadera exhibition. It is a remake of a Mesoamerican statue that features a reclining figure whose head faces forward 90 degrees and whose abdomen usually houses a bowl for sacrificial items and is often associated with Tlaloc, the Aztec god of rain and fertility. An almost incredible reenactment. To see it, the spectator is forced to pierce through the antique viewfinder we saw in the previous image, whose circular form remind us of Tlaloc's prominent eyes, in order to observe a small screen that loops 12 minutes of Leandra Becerra Lumbreras on her bed, the woman featured on the screen, the oldest person alive at the time, although Guinness refuses to put her in the record because she lost her birth certificate 40 years prior, and the last surviving soldadera of the Mexican Revolution. At 127 years of age, she reclined on her perch of pillows on a makeshift bed, a living chacmul, who a month after her encounter with Bustamante was to leave the earth, having outlived all of her children and many of her grandchildren. She finally told her story through the persistent tapping of an unknown rhythm in the video loop, her communicatory gesture revealing her engagement with the revolution for the first time in public and for the last time in private, to the team that now Bustamante gathered in their quest to meet the last living soldadera. I want to explain that. She couldn't speak anymore, so she just tapped in the video loop. It took over 100 years. She waited patiently, but her body spoke, and she was heard. Artist Moises Medina, who accompanied Bustamante's crew, attests that, and I quote, very little was vocalized, but much was said, end of quote. Becerra Lumbreras was one of the few who fought for her communal land grant and withstood the chiding of others as she demanded her revolutionary pension, and I quote, vocally insisting that she had bled, fought, and mothered children of the revolution, end of quote. The cleverness of this installation is the paradoxical analogy that Bustamante draws between Lumbreras and the Chacamul, a Mesoamerican statue whose role is not understood, who lays in an almost semi-supine position, except that it rests on its forearms, reclined, vulnerable, and yet active, located outside of the sacred temples but not part of them, spread throughout the diverse indigenous world across time and space, associated with fertility, but upon whose belly rested the bowl for the sacrificial victims, or reverential items, no one knows for sure. An icon that was misnamed by the person who discovered it. Not unlike the Soldadera, the name stuck. Jennifer Doyle, the curator of the exhibition, explains the work, and I quote, "Our intention as artist and curator is to invite the viewer of the exhibition to consider the possibilities of a speculative, even utopian thinking, as not a retreat from the here and now, but as a deep engagement with how we might imagine the here and now differently." End of quote. The women in my book may have frayed stories, occupy semi-supine positions, hover in the shadows between maternal instinct and macho valor, blackness and whiteness, respectability and audacity. But like Becerra Lumbreras, have outlived and questioned their very objection in the art that they have inspired, in the stories that are told or tapped with their fingers, and in the case of Becerra Lumbreras, in the very life she refused to leave behind as a supercentenarian. This pueblo is not monolithic. Indeed, it's composed of all different kinds of people, lifeways, histories, bodies, and saberes. The practice of daily life, the organic mixture of quotidian ritual, and the praxis of culture, even in the midst of its creation, points to the constant revolutions that happen when diverse people come together in the wake of violent events. Whether these events are slavery, invasions, revolts against tyranny, spiritual violence, the unjust appropriation of ancestral land, or gender aggression, the practice of living these events, of living rupture and continuity, generates a sense of pueblo, even when the pueblo itself is far from homogeneous. Art and popular culture can intervene, although not always evenly, when history leaves off. At least this has been the case with Mexico's Nobodies. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to entertain any questions. And again, thank you all for being here. This is the thrill of my life. 10 years of work, yes. May I ask you to identify yourself so I know who I'm talking to?
Danae Barr. I'm a researcher in the Hispanic division here at Library of Congress.
Wonderful.
I studied filmmaking, first of all, University of Maryland, College Park. Eisenstein, when I hear Eisenstein, immediately I need to know the name of that film. I'd like to see that film.
Que viva Mexico. Que viva Mexico. It is one of the first films made about the Mexican Revolution. He had designed it with a segment on the Soldadera in mind, but he ran out of Mexico because what he was doing, it's sort of like, oh, I'm sorry. It's a very sort of revolutionary documentary form. And so this is one of the most famous pieces. And of course, Mexicans look at it as Mexican art, but it was made by a Russian filmmaker and in Russian. So it's available on YouTube.
Never knew. That's fabulous.
You can see it on YouTube, but the quality's not good. And because of the visual imagery and the different, yes.
Thank you. Okay, so.
May I know who you are?
Oh, my name is Eve Ferguson. I work in the African section, African Middle Eastern division.
Wonderful.
Here in the library. And so my question is, contemporary artists like Lila Downs is now shining a light on Afro-Mexican music. Is there a greater acceptance in Mexican society of the contributions of Afro-Mexicans now than previously?
That is a spectacular question, and there's a greater awareness. I don't know if there's a greater acceptance. They're still not recognized. There was a Amongst scholars, there is. There's a whole field of Afro-Mexican studies, and there's Mexican scholars and there's North American scholars who have sort of in tandem engaged in both, sometimes at odds with each other. But yes, I mean, there's definitely a much broader recognition. Oh, yes, we did have some blacks, but they were, at the beginning of the colonial period. So there's a way in which it's sort of, it was so long ago. And after mestizaje, there's this lack of recognition for individual populations and communities that, in fact, still have vibrant Afro-Mexican cultures, for example, on the costas. There's a way in which they've relegated to coastal culture, but they were part of the intricate part of the construction of Mexican culture throughout the colonial period, because they weren't just relegated to the coast. They were, in fact, in the mining centers. That's where the slaves were. They worked in the mines. And so the particular case that I look at is not the Gulf Coast of Veracruz, where there is a general acceptance of blackness there, or even the Pacific Coast, where there were, Cimarron maroon colonies. No, there were more than maroon colonies. They were part of the mining communities. And so the chocolateras, so the women who made the chocolate, were almost always Afro-Mexican. There was a link between the two. So the general population is mixed in terms of how they accept it. Even the scholars will say that Chicanos, and Chicanas in particular, overdetermine the blackness of Mexican culture. Well, they exaggerate it. Still to this day, I mean, I've been to 3 conferences last year where I presented some material, and as a Chicana, they looked at me like, well, you guys are over-exaggerating it. That's part of the North American Academy and sort of a discourse of identity politic that's permeated Afro-diasporic studies. So it's mixed. Yes?
Yeah, my name is John Topping. I'm a cataloger here at the library.
Hi, John. Thanks.
Is there a distinction in Mexican Spanish between La Negra and La Mulata? There was that famous singer named La Negra, but I think normally typically you referred to Afro-Mexican women as mulatas. Is there a distinction between the two terms?
No, that's a great question, because it has to do with the naming. So it was very popular among Caribbean musicians in particular to be identified through that sort of nominal blackness. So, for example, her nephew took on El Negro too, El Peregrino El Negro or something like that. And so that's a way to over-accentuate the blackness, which then appealed to this sort of tropicalizing discourse of, she's La Negra, when in fact she's a mulata. So yeah, there's the etymological difference. I mean, mulatto is part of the racial taxonomies that were part of the colonial period. I mean, I'm not sure everyone knows the paintings of the casta paintings throughout the colonial period. Are we familiar with those, where all the different racial taxonomies were epitomized through portraiture, which then became, many of those, there was only 5, 6, maybe half a dozen that were regularly used, mulatto being one of the principal ones. But in terms of performativity, to take on el negro or la negra was very common, when in fact they were mulattos. It's also a term of endearment in the Caribbean. Ay, mira mi negra, vente pa acá mi negra. So it's a term of endearment, in addition to being a derogatory term, usually in the diminutive, ese negrito, esa negrita. But it depends. It really depends on the context. In Brazil, it's the same. It's often used as a term of endearment.
Hi, my name is George Rice.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. So I was born in Mexico City, and I just want to verify if what my grandfather, he's been telling me this for years. So one of the questions was, why we really never talk about black people in Mexico? He says basically one of the reasons is that, they were freed. They were not slaves in Mexico, and, it was never really an issue. So I just want to clarify that. And I had a question on your picture. You mentioned that she had a gun. Mexican culture tends to be machista. So I'm wondering if that's, comes from a feminist movement where women were allowed to carry arms, because I know for a fact in other cultures, women were, the homemaker, they stayed at home, took care of the kids. So I just found that piece fascinating.
It is. It's incredible. There's actually a transgender coronela who's also named Robles, Amelio Robles, who only chose to wear, she immediately transferred into male garb. Oftentimes when they were colonels, or when they had a military rank that was beyond just a common soldier, they would sort of perform that authority through dress, through the vestments. And so you'll notice what's interesting about that is that she still wears the earrings. There's this way in which she's still not abandoning her femaleness, no, her femininity in terms of the garb. So she's using both. So that sort of gesture is really interesting, you know. So, but definitely during the revolution, many soldaderas took up arms. Maybe they performed traditional female roles by bringing the domesticity of the home onto the battlefield. I mean, that in itself was incredibly radicalizing, to see women and children out on the battlefield hanging clothes, carrying their molcajetes, making beans. But then at the same time, when their soldier fell, they would often pick up the rifle and continue fighting for them, or they were looked to as leaders. I mean, one of the most important novels written by a Mexican, it's a testimonial novel by Elena Poniatowska, was precisely the interview of a soldadera who followed her father and then her husband into the war, and then when both of them fell, the soldiers looked to her to lead. So there's this way in which there's a fluidity in gender roles that wartime, the exigencies of wartime will permit. But what happens after the war? They decided that soldaderas were unacceptable. They made them wives. And that made it very difficult for them to seek their pensions as revolutionary participants. That's what makes the situation of Leandra Becerra so important, is that she actually demanded it as a veteran of the revolution, as a soldadera, no? So they took all different kinds of roles. They were often spies, smugglers, strategists. So they took on different roles, and then some were just simply cooks, and they were able to market themselves as, through their culinary expertise, their ability to make a lot out of nothing, because they handled the soldada, the soldier's money, and were able to purchase provisions. Remember, there was no commissary or even infirmary. So that's what the roles of the soldaderas did. With regards to the first comment on blacks in Mexico, yes, Mexico was, I think, the second country to abolish slavery. The second president of the Mexican Republic after independence from Spain was an Afro-Mexican. I mean, people don't know that. They get whitened later on. One of the primary revolutionary leaders was Morelos y Pavón. I mean, he was also an Afro-Mestizo. And during the colonial period, I think what your father was alluding to was there was a very prominent working class, freed black class. Why? Because slavery lasted a generation or two at most. There was certainly the chattel plantation model, which is what we think of when we think of slavery, these big cotton plantations. In Mexico, it would have been sugar, tobacco, añil, and minings, but there were also peddled off. A slave could often acquire the oficio, of his master, and the master often freed him in his own lifetime. And the children were often godchildren. So there's this patronage, of course, but they were often freed in their lifetime, so it would last a generation or two at most. And there was an urban class. It was an urban phenomenon. Mexico City had more blacks than it did Spaniards at one point, in part because of slavery. But it's this particularized, sort of localized slavery. Fruit sellers, a shoemaker. I mean, so they turned into a vibrant class that then became Hispanicized really early on. And so they mixed in really early on. So there's insistence on phenotype. They said, well, we don't really have what looks like Brazil or Cuba here in Mexico. Thus, we don't really have an important black population. But it mixed in really early on. And so the slave trade was abrogated very early on in Mexico as well. And they had rights because of canon law, because of the Pope. So they were able to appeal their rights. I'm not saying that slavery wasn't horrible in Mexico, but what I am saying is that they had a little more liberty to appeal through the church, through the mechanisms of the church, to appeal to have regular families and to get Sundays off and stay in the cities. Or they mixed in with indigenous populations, which is understudied, in part because there was, in colonial Mexico, República de los Españoles and República de los Indios. Many times blacks would escape to the indigenous communities, and then they were no longer counted. And the last part about that is that blacks also, there was no census because of that sort of viciousness with regards to the caste system. The sistema de castas, the second president he also eliminated the caste system so that they would all be Mexicans, but then unfortunately eliminated the record of blacks in Mexico. And so thus the invisibility for 200 years until now. Yes. What's your name?
Desiree.
Hi, Desiree.
Hi. Thank you so much for this. I look forward to reading the book. Can you give us a sense of what the relationship was between middle and upper class women who kind of busied themselves with like legal equity and feminism, feminist work, and the Soldadera?
Oh, during the Revolutionary period? Oh, that's a great question, because there's a lot, not a lot, but more written on precisely the upper class women who, I mean, the first battle cry of the Mexican Revolution, which preceded the Cuban Revolution, preceded the Russian Revolution, was actually at an upper class woman's house, Carmen Cerdán in northern Mexico. So they had a real important role, in part because they were completely on the outside of Mexican society. So because of the dictatorship, it was a paternalistic, patriarchal society. So women, in particular upper class women, so there has been some scholarship, Mexican scholars and North American scholars have focused a lot on that relationship. Also, soldaderas were not looked upon, they sort of like presented as this degenerate femininity. So there was certainly class tensions. One of the most important, so they would not have taken nicely to being called soldaderas, no, because it was sort of a pejorative way to call some sort of like trashy woman who followed the troops, right? It was almost like calling them a prostitute, right? Whereas Adelita acquired this sort of sweetheart intonation. So definitely, I mean, but one of the most important figures, Leonora Magnon, who wrote a book that was not published in her lifetime. She went broke supporting the revolution. She founded the White Cross in Mexico and was one of the primary advisors to the Carranza, who became president afterwards, regime. She was completely unrecognized up until 20 years ago when Chicana scholar Clara Lomas recovered her book that was rejected over 20 times by different editorials in Mexico and in the United States. She wrote her book in Spanish and in English, and it's called La Rebelde, no, the Rebel. And so certainly she talks about, oftentimes will be disinclined to call the female companions soldaderas. She'll call them the nurse or something else. Nelly Campobello did the same. She wrote a beautiful set of short stories on the Mexican Revolution, and she also, in a subsequent revision, took the word soldadera out and replaced it with woman or muchacha, no? Because, that, I mean, in a way to not reduce them to that level. So they were very much, there's a distinction between those class levels, yet women of upper classes joined the revolutionary forces, were often strategists. The Zapatista cause had, and the Carranza had a female strategist and orator that wrote 5 books on the Mexican Revolution. None of that is recognized. Thank you so much for coming. This has been such an honor for me to be here. Thank you, Georgette.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.